Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about minority governments in Canada, why they seem messy, unstable, and maybe even dramatic, but also why that exact instability is actually built into how our parliamentary system works. The main argument today is going to be that minority governments often end up being more accountable, more creative, and more compromising than majority governments due to the fact that they can't rely on automatic support. They have to work for it. So instead of thinking of minority governments as a problem, I'm going to show you how they reveal what responsible government looks like when no party has total control. Canada loves minority governments, apparently. Canada has had quite a few minority governments recently, and honestly, it makes sense. With so many parties and strong regional differences, getting over 50% of the seats has become a lot harder. But this doesn't mean the system is broken. In Canada, a government survives only if it maintains the confidence of the House of Commons. That's the core idea behind responsible government. Minority governments feel unstable, for sure, but they also make parliament more active. The executive can't act like it has a blank check. It has to constantly check where support is coming from. So, yes, minorities are chaotic, but they also make the system more accountable than majorities ever do. So, before we get further into it, you may be wondering what exactly is a minority government? It's when the governing party has less than 50% of the seats in the House of Commons. That means they can't automatically pass legislation. They can't rely on party discipline to push everything through. So they need at least one other party to get anything done. This is why minority governments are always described as an election in waiting. Every major vote is a confidence check. Every budget could bring them down. And because the government doesn't control most of the seats, everything depends on negotiation, cooperation, and timing. Minority governments always operate under a kind of built in instability. They can fall at any time, and all it takes is losing confidence. But here's what people often forget, which is to actually defeat a government, the opposition has to work together. Usually, two or more parties need to coordinate, and coordinating parties that disagree on almost everything is not easy. This is why minority governments sometimes last far longer than expected. But the moment a support party pulls back, like when the NDP stepped away from the Liberals, everything shifts. Suddenly, the government becomes extremely vulnerable, and Canada becomes what our slides call an election waiting to happen. This this instability is not random. It's part of responsible government. A majority government can push through policies pretty easily, but a minority, not a chance. This is where the idea of compromise really matters. A minority government knows it can't govern alone, so it becomes more moderate by necessity. It listens more, it negotiates more, it avoids extremes because extremes risk triggering an election. This pressure to stay reasonable can actually create better and more creative policies. When parties have to collaborate, you get decisions that include more perspectives, not just one party's agenda. Minority governments survive through different kinds of cooperation. Things like written agreements, which these outline exactly how a support party will help keep the government in power. Informal understandings slash agreements, which means nothing is written, but everyone understands the basic terms, or case by case deals, which means parties negotiate on each bill separately. Canada prefers flexibility, which and written agreements and coalitions make parties look too tied together. So, most minority governments rely on informal support or case by case deals. This brings us to accountability, which is one of the biggest strengths of minority government. A majority government basically controls parliament. Party discipline means they can pass whatever they want. Opposition criticism often doesn't matter. But In a minority government, things completely flip. The government has to defend itself constantly, not just to voters, but to parliament itself. Opposition parties become stronger, committees become more active, the House has more power over the executive. So even though minorities feel unstable, they actually create a more balanced relationship between parliament and the government. Now, electoral accountability is where things get a little more complicated. Because multiple parties contribute to decision making, voters sometimes don't know who to reward or who to punish. Did the government pass that policy or did the support party force it? And it depends on who you ask. This is especially tricky for smaller parties that help prop up a minority. They want influence, but not so much that voters think they're responsible for everything the government does, especially when it's wrong. This tension sets up what we're going to talk about next, which is why visibility matters so much. When a party, sorry, when a party signs a written agreement with the government, it becomes highly visible to voters. Suddenly, it looks like they're practically part of the government. Now, what does that mean? It means more blame, less independence, and often, according to some research, electoral punishment. Support parties in written agreements frequently lose seats in the next election because voters hold them responsible for unpopular decisions, even if they didn't fully control them. This is why written agreements are risky, because visibility cuts both ways. Now let's talk about the opposite situation, which is informal agreements. These are political gold. Seriously. They're low visibility, which means they support parties, but they still look independent. They can claim credit for things they influenced, but voters don't tie them directly to the government's mistakes. This is what some may call the sweet spot, which and the influence without being blamed, cooperation without losing identity, and stability without punishment, which all and they can support parties in informal agreements almost always perform better than those in written deals, which is very interesting. A perfect example is the 2022 to 2024 Liberal NDP written agreement. The Liberals needed stability. The NDP wanted progress on healthcare, dental care, and affordability. Together, they made a very public, very visible written deal. It worked for a while. It delivered policy wins and gave Parliament stability, but because it was written, it also made the NDP look tied to the government. And when public opinion shifted, the NDP took heat for decisions they did not fully control. This case shows exactly why written agreements can also carry risk. But it wasn't all a downfall. The Liberal NDP agreement delivered real outcomes like dental care for uninsured families, movement on pharmacare, and better long term care standards. These are perfect examples of how minority governments can be more creative and compromising because no one party had total control. They had to negotiate, and that negotiation led to concrete, visible policy outcomes and improvement. Another great example is Harper's 2008 minority. Facing the threat of defeat, the Conservatives presented a moderate budget that was far more centrist than their usual platform. They did it because minority governments must adapt to survive, which shows pressure goes to compromise, which goes to moderation. So, at the end of the day, what do minority governments teach us? We can see that instability is built into the Canadian government at this point, and it is not a flaw. We can see that minority governments depend on compromise and cooperation to survive. We can see that They encourage moderate and more widely supported policy. They increase accountability because Parliament gains power. Written agreements boost visibility, and at the same time, they have electoral danger. And informal support and agreements are the so called sweet spot, we could say, for political compromise. At the end of the day, minority governments might feel unpredictable, but they actually force parties to listen, to negotiate, and to work with each other, which is kind of the whole point of responsible government and our democratic system.